Exposure is achieved by the combined use of three elements: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. All three of them are equally important in properly exposing your image. To make it really simple, I'm gonna take each of these elements and break it down into three parts: what it is, what it does, and what it affects. Let's go. Aperture or iris is actually the only one that does not have to do with the camera itself. But don't let that confuse you because it's actually really easy to understand. Aperture is just the hole that light passes through to hit the sensor. Remember how the dark box had this hole to let light in? Lenses have that same hole, but it's a little bit more advanced. The aperture is made up of several blades that have the ability to open and close, making the hole bigger or smaller. The bigger the hole, the more light is able to enter into the camera, which results in a brighter image. The smaller the hole, the less light is able to enter, which means a darker image. Aperture is most commonly measured in f-stops, which is written as the letter F followed by a number like f2 or f16. The smaller this number, the bigger the hole or wider the aperture. The bigger the number, the smaller the hole or narrower the aperture. That might seem counterintuitive, but it's actually because the number is a fraction. You can think of f2 as 1 over 2 and f16 as 1 over 16. And if we take a second to remember what we learned in math class all those years ago, the bigger the denominator, the smaller the number. All lenses have a maximum aperture. This is the absolute widest that the blades can open up. And you'll actually see this number on the lens itself. So aperture is directly responsible for how much light is able to enter into the camera body, but it has a secondary effect on something called depth of field. Simply put, depth of field is how blurry or sharp the area around your subject is. A wider aperture will result in a shallow depth of field and a blurry background, while a narrow aperture will result in deeper focus. The area in focus is greater. Now, there are several other things that affect depth of field, so let me know if you'd be interested in a dedicated video explaining all of that. Next up is shutter speed. What's shutter speed? Well, that sound is the shutter closing. So if aperture is the gateway for light to enter into the camera, then the shutter is the gate. How fast or slow the shutter opens and closes equals how long the image is exposed for. Like aperture, this affects the overall brightness of the image, and like aperture, it's also a fraction. But this time it refers to the amount of time the shutter is open for, and it's measured in seconds. So if your shutter speed is set to 1 over 100, your shutter is open for 1/100th of a second. The longer the shutter is open, the slower the shutter speed. The image is exposed for longer and it's brighter. The shorter it's open, the faster the shutter speed. The image is exposed for less and it's darker. Because shutter speed is responsible for how long the image is exposed for, it also affects how much movement is captured within the image. This is true for both photo and video. And it's really important to remember that the camera interprets movement as motion blur. Take this car, for example. If our shutter is open for a whole second, the camera will see the car move all the way from here to here. And if we look at our picture, it's just one big blurred motion. But if our shutter is only open for 1/1000th of a second, it only sees the car at this exact moment. The reason this is the same for video is because video is just made up of a bunch of pictures per second. We call that frame rate, but that's a topic for another video. Long exposure is used to capture images like this, and in film, it's used to create dreamy sequences like this, or disorienting sequences like this. On the opposite end of the spectrum, a fast shutter is used to capture action like this in sports photography, or fight scenes like this in action movies. Last but certainly not least is our good friend ISO. And if you think that ISO stands for something, that might help you remember what exactly it does. Fortunately, you'd be wrong. ISO stands for the International Organization for Standardization, which is an organization responsible for standardizing way more than just photography-related things. In fact, in the context of photography, ISO doesn't even directly refer to the organization. Go figure. The term ISO originally referred to the sensitivity of film stock back in the day. The higher the ISO rating, the more sensitive the film stock was to light. And obviously the opposite is also true. That being said, purchasing the right film stock for the correct environment was the first and most important step of film photography. If you're going to be shooting outside during the day, you would buy lower sensitivity film stock to account for the large light source. If you were shooting inside or at night, you would buy higher sensitivity film stock to account for not having as much light. Digital camera manufacturers have adopted this function for their sensors. And as you know, you don't have to buy a whole bunch of different sensors for the different lighting scenarios that you find yourself in. That's because your camera has an ISO range. Base ISO is the lowest possible ISO value that your sensor can operate at. And as you turn it up, you'll notice that the image gets brighter. A lot of people refer to ISO as fake light, and that's because on the surface, that's essentially what it is. ISO is digitally brightening your image by increasing the voltage to the sensor. But this comes with one very nasty side effect. The higher you push your camera's ISO, the more you introduce digital noise or grain into your image. When there's not much, it's hardly noticeable, and that's because ISO directly affects how clean your image is. If you want the cleanest possible image, you can research your camera's native ISO. You'll notice deviating from native ISO introduces very little noise, but the second you push it too far, it almost completely ruins the image. For that reason, ISO should be the last thing that you use to compensate for exposure. Like shooting on film stock back in the day, you should know the environment that you're going to be in and the lighting scenarios that you're going to be shooting in and set your ISO accordingly.